from the News Channel 5 network. This is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. This week, we again look back at the 112th Tennessee General Assembly, which just recently ended 2 years of work here in Nashville. As usual, the legislature was full of both achievements and controversies, some of which loom on even as many lawmakers go home to run for re-election. Last week, we sought the perspective of the Speaker of the State Senate, Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally. This week, we seek thoughts and wisdom from the Speaker of the House, Sexton. Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for coming back on the program. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
We have lots to discuss in terms of controversies, as we always do, but what do you see as the biggest accomplishment of the legislature this year?
Well, I think it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to the governor, obviously it's K-12 education funding. Redoing the formula was a big success for him. If you're talking to me, I would say it's probably the truth in sentencing guidelines that we passed.
Let's talk about that, because that bill that you and Speaker McNally put together and pushed through the legislature was a lot broader than what wound up finally passing. Did you have to make a deal with the governor to get him to keep from vetoing that bill?
Well, with any piece of legislation, you want to sit down with all stakeholders and individuals and walk through the process of what they're thinking, what we're thinking. You know, we met the governor, what we felt like was about halfway. We didn't get everything we want. He didn't get everything he wanted, but it does have rehabilitation incentives in it, as well as some harsh penalties.
The governor's message that came back, both of you and Lieutenant Governor McNally, saying that he would let the bill go into law without his signature, was sure not very positive. I mean, the governor claims in Tennessee and other states, laws like this have, and I'll quote here, resulted in significant operational and financial strain on correctional systems. He also said about the new law, and again I'm quoting, the policy will result in more victims, higher recidivism, increased crime and prison overcrowding, all with an increased cost to taxpayers. Seems the governor's allowing this to go into effect, but he thinks it's going to fail. What do you say in return?
Well, I don't know how you can feel about putting violent criminals in jail for longer periods of time. The 2020, there was a U.S. Sentencing Commission study that put in place that said if someone is sentenced longer than 5 years, they're 30% less likely to recidivate. If they're in there 10 years or longer, they're 45% less likely to recidivate, which means less crime.
So the governor's wrong?
What I will say is those soft on crime groups that are advising him are wrong. What I will say is common sense tells you if you lock up violent criminals longer, they're less likely to be on the streets, less likely to commit crime. Your crimes will go down. You also have to take into account about victims. All these groups want to talk about victims, and when they come out of jail, they don't want any more victims. But what they're discounting is if some of these people that committed these violent crimes were in prison prior to the next crime, for longer, they would not have been there to commit that crime in the first place.
The new law is also criticized as being a mass incarceration measure. Others also say it removes any incentive for inmates to participate in programs that help rehabilitate themselves and shorten their sentences.
Well, that's just factually wrong. I mean, we do have rehabilitation incentives in here. Even for the 100% people, there's an incentive. If you want to have privileges like watch TV, you have to do rehabilitation programming. For the other offenses, that goes to 85% minimum mandatory that you have to serve. There's rehabilitation services in there, programs that you have to take to reduce your sentence. What we did take away is the credits for good behavior. Good behavior should be expected in prison. And then the other argument that they want to talk about is the cost to the taxpayers. Our job as elected officials is to protect the communities, protect the citizens of our state. What's a better way than to put violent criminals in prison for longer times and draw that line in the sand and help nonviolent offenders? And there's a difference between the two.
Tennessee went through a period where there was a tough on crime situation and we had to build a whole lot of new prisons, basically ordered by the federal court. You don't think that's going to happen again with your bill?
What's wrong with building new prisons? What I will say is if you have violent criminals...
Well, they cost a lot of money to the taxpayers for one thing.
How much is a life worth to someone who got killed by a violent criminal who wasn't in jail because they should have been serving a longer sentence? That's my argument back. What I will say is you have to distinguish between violent criminals and nonviolent criminals. 60% of our prisons are made up of violent criminals. So we have 40% of our population that's nonviolent. Let's work with the nonviolent offenders. Let's work to try to get them rehabilitated. Let's do programs for juvenile intervention, cut off the pipeline. But there has to be a line that if you cross it and you commit a violent crime, you have to do the time.
Another area that's not quite truth in sentencing, at least as your bill defines it, is also been the state's use of capital punishment. We had an execution scheduled to be done by lethal injection that the governor stopped. Apparently there's some kind of protocol procedures that weren't followed. He's asked for a third-party outside investigation of this and put off any further executions, and maybe for the rest of this year. The governor's been awfully tight-lipped about what this is all about, what the problem actually is. Have you and Lieutenant Governor been briefed about this? Do you know what's wrong?
We had a little bit of briefing. I don't know how much of the details that we got compared to what's out there. What I do know is the governor has to be very careful as they're doing an investigation about releasing information, making sure it's factual and not non-factual. So they're going through that process right now.
They have a problem with the court case they've got. Apparently, the Attorney General, who's now leaving, said that apparently the state had given some wrong information to the court, but they didn't say what the wrong information was or what the right information is.
Well, but they're still looking through that. And so if there's a possibility for litigation, you're going to go through your due diligence to make sure that what happened. And they're going to be very careful on what they put out until they understand exactly what it was that happened.
Any use of capital punishment is always controversial, but it seems lethal injections in Tennessee have been dogged repeatedly with lots of problems and criticisms. Should Tennessee continue to use that method for capital punishment, or should you just stick strictly with the electric chair?
No, I think you can use that. I think the problem that we have in statutes, we give the inmate the possibility to determine which one that they want to be used, and I think that puts us in a hard spot about if lethal injection is not available and they chose lethal injection, having to postpone their date. And so what I would like to do is go back in the law and look at it to where it's the state's determination on which one to use and have more leeway in which one we can do.
The 112th General Assembly ended its work still under a cloud of a federal investigation and a grand jury probe regarding campaign finance irregularities. One House lawmaker has already resigned, and several others appear to be implicated in what has been disclosed so far. Things have been quiet in recent weeks. You've been briefed frequently, I think, by the feds. Is the investigation over or still out there?
It's still ongoing.
Have they told you anything else about it? Because it's been awfully quiet the last couple of weeks.
Well, just because it's quiet doesn't mean it's not ongoing. What I will say, it's up to them to make the determination when they're going to continue to go. As you know, a bunch of us went through as grand jury witnesses to give testimony. Not that we were subpoenaed for any wrongdoing. Actually, we didn't do any wrongdoing. And so when you panel a grand jury, there's indictments coming. The date that they're coming, I'm not sure, but I can tell you they're coming.
Your predecessor, Speaker Glenn Cassida, is not seeking re-election. He'd been implicated in what's already been disclosed in the probe. He recently was badly beaten seeking an office within Williamson County, local office there. Is that a sign that voters, including Republicans, are very unhappy with what they see going on Capitol Hill in this matter?
No, I don't think so. I think that vote was all about Glenn Cassida and Williamson County.
Our guest on Inside Politics this week is the Speaker of the House, Cameron Sexton. Back to continue our conversation with him after you watch these messages.